Abbas, and I'm the Leader Speak series coordinator. I'd like to welcome you to the second installment of the Leader Speak series. The Leader Speak series is an annual initiative that reaches out to the community with diverse leadership themes. This year, there are 6 scheduled speakers that will expand on this year's theme, Regenerate, Planting Ideas for Generations. The theme focuses on motivating students and community members to become more active and be a part of the changes they want to see, whether that be in their own lives or in the community. Our second guest speaker is Executive Director and Editor of Iowa Center for Public Affairs, Lyle Muller. He will be presenting Who's Watching Out for You, which will cover the threats that exist in the aftermath of dramatic cuts in the number of reporters, how traditional media is reorganizing as new media emerges, and how to create engaging journalism in the United States. Without further ado, can you please help me welcome Lyle Muller to the stage?
Thank you, Lauren. That was really nice. I appreciate the fact that I've been invited to speak here. It's an honor and a privilege for me to do this. I know that we are competing with the Chicago Cubs because that game is now getting underway, and poor Cubs fans, they're so excited. They're the type of people who go to palm readers every year to see if this is the year. I'd like to go to a palm reader sometime and sit down and say nothing, and then have that person say, "How can I help you?" And I'll say, "You tell me." I want to talk to you about who's watching out for you, the changing face of journalism. And I've had a chance to see this up front just in Iowa, and I want to tell you it's going on across the country, but also across the world. I was just visiting with a friend of mine over the weekend. He is from Arizona. He used to be a news director at KPNX in Phoenix. He's retired and spent time in Vietnam with 2 other people who are working on a consulting contract with the communist-run news agency there. The big concern with this news agency is how do we get young people to engage in our journalism and in our media, because they're just turning away from it. We're suffering from disruption. They're going to all of this social media, and they're seeing media from other spots, and they're not watching our boring newscast with people in communist uniforms giving them dogma. How can we get them to engage with us? So it is a worldwide issue. And that's why I wanted to talk about who's watching out for you, because I think there's a changing face of journalism in the United States and in Iowa as well. And we've read a lot about it, but there are impacts that exist. So let me just start with this notion that the disruption's happening now, because the fact is it's been going on for a long time. These are the old town criers who used to deliver the news, and we've certainly advanced from that to pamphlets and leafletting once the printing press existed. And then eventually we had this thing called radio that was giving us news, and then television, which was going to revolutionize things. This is how I grew up. I grew up watching this guy with my parents because they liked CBS News and they liked Edward R. Murrow, and he was the face of everything good in journalism in the 1950s, even though he was in black and white and smoked on television all of the time. But this is how we got our news and information, and there's been total disruption. And I'm going to jump forward not just to Twitter, but to show you that on Twitter, if you go to @BreakingNews, you can actually get breaking news from a site that has 9.25 million followers. Each morning, I'm an early riser. I wake up at 5 o'clock. It drives my wife nuts because she doesn't. And so what I'm able to do in an hour until she gets up is I start my day, instead of with my morning newspaper, which I'm sorry to say, I start my day going through a Twitter feed of all of the news organizations to see what overnight national and international news exists. And then I do grab my newspaper because the newspaper has been good to me. I spent a long time in newspapers, 33 years, in fact, 25 of them at the Cedar Rapids Gazette, where I finished up my career at the Gazette as its executive editor. So newspapers are important to me, but I start my day by seeing what's going on the internet. In fact, this is, listen, here's how we get our news. It's newspapers, radio, television, now smartphones. We're always getting our news and information from whatever is in our hand or the handiest for us now. And while we used to have in our hand the ability to go up and turn a television switch to one of 3 stations in your market, if you were in Iowa like I was, now we have a smartphone and we can get news and information from there. And there has been real impact, and you've heard about it, but I'm going to show you exactly what that impact is. Key audience trends, 2015 over 2014, and this is from the State of the News Media. This is the most recent report that the Pew Research Center put out, and they did an analysis of the Nielsen ratings, but also the Alliance for Audited Media, which is the way that newspaper circulation is counted and certified. Newspaper circulation from 2014 to 2015 down 7%. Cable television up 8%, no surprise. We are entering an election cycle in 2015. Network evening news up 1%. Keep in mind, these are up from small numbers because there has been a lot of erosion. Network morning news down 2%. Now, the startling thing to me is local television late news. This is the bread and butter of a local television station. Their late newscast, that 10 o'clock newscast or 9 o'clock newscast as the Fox stations are doing. It was the prime newscast that people would look to, and now the numbers are down 5%. Local morning and TV news in the evening, the early evening, also down. Startling numbers. And here's the impact then. What happens? Advertisers notice that they are getting fewer audience members out there with this reduction in numbers. So newspaper economics. Newspaper revenue down 8% nationally from 2014, excuse me, to 2015. Cable television revenue is up because people are hot there. It's a hot thing right now. Network TV evening news, even though the viewership is down, the revenue is up 6%. So advertisers haven't caught on yet. And the TV morning news, even though people are bailing on that at a rate of about 2% over 1 year, the revenue is up 14%. So advertisers still see some value there. But local television down 7% for their local news. And that is really startling because revenue had been going up. Local TV revenue since the 2011 primaries, or in Iowa, the caucuses, up 4%. So there was a precipitous drop last year. Now, you'll see revenue go up in 2016 at television stations because their bread and butter now is political advertising. There was a day when television newscasts were full of car ads, bank ads, local pharmacy ads, and in Iowa, Furidan ads, and all of the different pesticides that you could get, the Farm Bureau. And when election season came, television station managers hated it because they had to give political advertising time to candidates at reduced rates. What has happened now is that all of those other advertisers are finding different places to reach their audiences, and television stations love the elections. And in fact, television stations plan their budgets around those elections because that is when the big revenue is coming in. And by the way, you see digital ads up 20%. Don't get too excited about that. Digital advertising still is fairly low, at least in traditional media. So what kind of impact does that have on what you see as a consumer? The biggest impact is a reduction in resources at news organizations to tell you news and information that you've become accustomed to. The American Society of News Editors every year does a survey and census to try to find out what's going on in the newsrooms across the country in newspapers. And in 2015, the most recent hard numbers available for the newsroom census shows that there were 32,900 full or part-time journalists working. That's reporters, photographers, editors, copy editors. all of those people trying to produce a product that you can consume called a newspaper. And this is pretty dramatic because this is at 1,400 newspapers. It's down 3,800 from the previous year. But what's really remarkable, if you see this graph in 2015, is at the right-hand side. If you look at 10 years ago, we had 54,100 journalists in newsrooms and newspapers across the country, 39% more than now. And if you go back 15 years to 2001, 56,393 journalists in newspapers. We are at a capacity that's 40% fewer than 15 years ago. 40% fewer journalists are in newspapers in America now than existed in 2001. And issues arise. So ASNE, the American Society of News Editors, worries first of all about fewer reporters, photojournalists, editors, copy editors, all of those people going into producing these newspapers. So that's one problem. But another problem is building diversity in newsrooms. And the most recent American Society of News Editors survey came out and said that about 17% of newsrooms have minorities. But there is a serious lack of diversity at a time when we are becoming a more diverse nation every year. This exodus of newsrooms has included Iowa. In 2007 and 2008, there were massive layoffs in newsrooms. 2009 as well, the year I became editor of the Gazette. The 2011, and these are people who were laid off not because of the work that they were doing, but because of what newspapers and other industries call right-sizing. Workers call that downsizing. Companies call it right-sizing. But Brian Duffy was a well-known political cartoonist at the Des Moines Register. Through nothing that he did, nor nothing that the Des Moines Register thought he was doing wrong, lost his job because of the lack of resources or the reduction of resources that forced the Register to make hard decisions about what their future would be, what type of journalism they were capable of doing, and by how many people. The Washington Bureau, Jane Norman gone in 2008, Phil Brazier in 2011, Sean Keeler, a sports columnist a lot of people like. And they're not the only ones. 1991, Jane Shore Meisner won a Pulitzer Prize. 20 years later, she was gone because of staff reductions. John Gapps won several awards for his photojournalism in the first Persian Gulf War, gone. Paul Jensen, a photo editor with whom I worked at the Gazette more than 30 years, no position for him. Roland Banderab, the person who took over for him, was gone 4 years later. Greg Smith, a friend of mine, worked for the Associated Press. This is a neat article that he wrote about a businessman and entrepreneur in Fairfield, Iowa. Greg Smith was working in the Iowa City Bureau for the Associated Press. Eventually, Associated Press wanted to change its direction, and Greg left. He was not laid off. He was able to leave. He went to the Iowa City Press-Citizen, where he was training young journalists as its assistant editor until 2011. When the Press-Citizen eliminated the city editor's position, but also the managing editor's position. Jim Lewis had just won an Iowa Freedom of Information Council. Skip Weber, friend of the First Amendment Award for his dogged work at forcing the University of Iowa to release records in a rape case that the University of Iowa did not want to release. Cindy Haddish, a colleague of mine at the Gazette in 2013, a well-known health reporter, and Terry Coyle, who was the guy at the Gazette who never had to look up how to spell a name or how to what to remember in history from 20 years ago because he had this photographic memory. Always was the guy, the go-to guy. And yet all of these layoffs come at a time when Americans say they are craving journalism, especially good journalism. Investigative reporters and editors 4 years ago did a study in which they asked news consumers what they wanted most in their news media. Weather comes first. No surprise to us in Iowa, but guess what? They care about weather somewhere else. But number 2, investigative reporting. Along with business news and economic news, medical breakthroughs real close, and politics and consumer issues right behind. But in second place tied is investigative reporting, and what we have done as an industry is we have eliminated resources to do it very well. And the reason investigative reporting gets cut first is it's expensive. A good investigative piece might take a year, 6 months. Something like that, and I'll tell you, someone who's counting beans for your newsroom, and I don't blame them because they're making economic decisions, comes in and sees one person over here who is in the newspaper 5 times a week, and one person over here, what's their name? I haven't seen them in the paper ever. Except when you tell them, oh, they were in that story a year ago when we covered slumlords. Oh, that was a good story. Yeah, that's the person who did that. We spent a year investigating that. Oh. And so investigative reporters end up being the first to go. And yet, we have examples of the importance of good investigative reporting. The Des Moines Register recently received accolades from Columbia Journalism Review for the work that it's doing as a watchdog journalism organization. So at the Des Moines Register, they've gone through a lot of change, and you saw the layoffs, but they have focused on investigative and watchdog journalism. And the Columbia Journalism Review gave them high marks for a lawsuit they had filed up in Worth County, Iowa, for an incident last fall. An inmate was in the jail, had been tasered, and died in custody. The authorities up there didn't want to release records about what happened. The Des Moines Register sued. Another lawsuit, a 2012 video that shows up at the Iowa juvenile home, an employee slamming a female inmate, the inmate's head against the wall. It was a huge thing. You read about it, you heard about it. The Des Moines Register was leading the charge in reporting and trying to expose what happened up there. Eventually, the home was closed, the employee was fired, but the Register is still in a court fight trying to get the video to show what happened. And the reason the video is being withheld, and I think there can be a reasonable argument about this between health rights, privacy rights, and the public's right to know about a public institution's handling of an incident. But the Iowa Public Information Board has sided with the state, saying that the inmate's confidentiality could be harmed, so we are not releasing the video to show what happened that forced the state to close a juvenile home. The Burlington Hawkeye has been involved with a court case in trying to get video of the aftermath of an accidental shooting. A deputy going to a complaint at a home was being charged by a dog, slipped on ice as he was firing a gun, and accidentally killed the dog's owner. And the video of the shooting has been released, but then it stops, and the state says the police department says we're not going to show anymore. And the Burlington Hawkeye says the aftermath of that shooting tells us something about policing in our community. We have a right to see that. And the Public Information Board has been split on this, and the Hawkeye has spent quite a bit of money trying to get that resolved. You may have heard of the Iowa film scandal some years ago. The Iowa Film Office giving extraordinary tax increases to movie makers coming into the state. Des Moines Register reporting that. Government transparency audit. Last year, IowaWatch, my organization, worked with the Center for Public Integrity and news organizations in all 50 states doing a meticulous study of government integrity. How open is government? And we had a list of questions that we had to ask different government entities to see if they would respond with openness, such as, may we see this record, yes or no? We spent a year doing that, and then the Des Moines Register reporter, Jason Noble, vetted it, to make sure that everything was going all right, and then researchers with the Center for Public Integrity vetted it more, and eventually we had a report that showed that Iowa, when it comes to transparency, gets a D+, which makes it one of the more open states in the United States. It got an F in judiciary openness. It got an F in how transparent lobbies are. Are we keeping track of lobbyists? So this is the type of watchdog journalism that can be done if we have enough resources. At the national level, the Washington Post is re-imaging itself. We have new players on the field, such as ProPublica, which is a nonprofit news organization which already has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, Politico, the Center for Public Integrity, Texas Tribune. These are the names of new players who are coming out on the scene. And to get an understanding of why they matter, let's take a look at what media we used in 2000. Doesn't seem too long ago, but MP3 and Napster were big deals. They're here to stay. And that DVD player that might still be sitting under your disc player because you think, well, I can't just get rid of it because I have all of this VHS stuff. How will I play it? It was starting to go out. We had those flippy phones. It's the only thing my wife ever wanted until she found out she could get the internet and send pictures of her grandchildren to her aunts, uncles, and her sister. Cable news. CNN was 20 years old, but Fox News and MSNBC were infants. Go up to 2010, and we have Americans spending more time following the news than ever before, but they're starting to drift to ideological news outlets. Who watches and why? Pew Research Center studied. Go to 2016, and here we are getting the news from, there's my Twitter. I snuck my granddaughter in too, sorry. But there you go. Oh yeah, and TweetDeck, because I can't just look at one Twitter feed. And yeah, Instagram, forget it. I can't do it. It's not enough. I don't have time for Facebook. Yahoo News, I actually don't go to Yahoo News all that much, but there's a reason I'm showing Yahoo News, which aggregates, right? That's what we're in. We're in the era of aggregating news and collecting news from other sources, putting it together so that you can look at it, Lyle, on your Twitter feed in the morning. Here's why I'm showing you Yahoo News. It's the #1 media we use according to ebizmba.com. The #1 news source that Americans use is Yahoo News, Google News #2, Huffington Post #3. I'm going to say something about Huffington Post, actually a little about Yahoo and Google also. The news model when you're aggregating is you take stuff for free and you put it on a website. Huffington Post's business model is to pay a few people, but for the most part, encourage folks to give them material free so that it can be published, and your reward is that maybe up to 20 million people might see your story. That's your reward. Eat on that. CNN, New York Times, some of those that we now know and understand, CNN, New York Times, Fox News, NBC, Mail Online, the #8 read news source in the United States from Great Britain. We also use this media. Direct information from politicians and people who want to have or have power and influence over the events, policies, things that change our norm or change our notion of the norm. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump do not need news organizations. They can reach us directly. Last week, I talked with a political science professor for a radio program that IowaWatch does that airs statewide, and she suggested that Donald Trump is the first presidential candidate to tweet his way to within a step of the White House. We need a chance to look, though, at news critically. I gave you the list of some of the things that the Hawkeye and the Des Moines Register and those other news media organizations do, but I'm going to show you 2 graphics that should explain why you want someone other than government telling you what the state is doing. The first reason is because the state spends a lot of money. And an independent press, independent journalism, takes a look at how that money is being spent. And so go back to some of the issues that I talked about. The film office. There was another controversy about the Iowa Association of School Boards having meetings out of the state. There was a story, the Des Moines Register did that. The Des Moines Register famously has written about other cases as well, how bidding is done for public projects, for example, when the state tries to hide that. But this is a lot of money, $8.5 billion in the general fund that the state is raising for this fiscal year, or the fiscal year that just ended June 30th. And there are transfers in there, so that's why you have two numbers. Money gets transferred from one state agency to another state agency, so it's $7.1 billion afterwards. General fund appropriations this year, $7.2 billion. This past year, the fiscal year that ended June 30th. That's how much the state appropriated out to the Department of Transportation, Department of Public Safety, the regions, universities, all of the different things that the state funds. And coming up next, this current fiscal year, that's up to $7.4 billion. And so what we try to argue, with good journalism comes watchdog journalism to pay attention to what's going on. Now, I wanted at this point just give you a little bit of idea of what I do. I was the editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette. It really wasn't long. It was 3 years. Before that, I was a senior editor. They gave me that title because it's the title that you give some editor who then will do everything, and they don't have to keep changing your title. But at a certain point in time, I found myself farther and farther detached from journalism and young people involved with journalism training, because I had worked with interns and liked it a lot. I liked being editor too, don't get me wrong, but I spent more time with the sales staff and marketing than I did with reporters. So I joined the Iowa Center for Public Affairs Journalism. The Iowa Center for Public Affairs Journalism was founded in February 2010. And it's an independent nonprofit news organization. It exists to do investigative journalism and also in-depth community affairs journalism in collaboration with other media. So we actually have partnerships with the biggest papers in the state, the Des Moines Register, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Burlington Hawkeye, Sioux City Journal. We're published in more than 15 papers this year. Last year it was more than 45 because I participated in a newspaper project on cold cases with them. It was founded by Steve Berry. This is what Steve Berry would do. He was at the time a university professor at Iowa, over in Iowa City. He would teach in-depth reporting, and students would turn in stories, and he would feel miserable about the A's. And so here I am on a college campus talking about how a professor felt miserable about A's. The reason he felt miserable about them was he was the only person who read that journalism. And he would lament about that. And he would give the kid an A and hand it back and say, wow, I hope someone publishes this someday. You'll have to tell this story somewhere. And he was talking with others about that, and from that grew the development of IowaWatch, which is patterned after other nonprofit news organizations. So I got started as this journalism program to produce and also encourage investigative journalism to work with others. So IowaWatch, while we do our own journalism, we promote good journalism that others are doing. And there still is a lot of good journalism in Iowa. I am here to tell you that good journalism exists all across this state. There just is less of it. If you recall all of those layoffs that I was showing you, think about this. The average reporter at an Iowa newspaper produces perhaps 3 to 5 news stories a day. More if they're at a smaller paper, less if they're at a larger paper. More if they're covering breaking news and a lot of stories develop, less if they are given a chance to work on a project that takes a little more time. If you take 5 reporters out of the newsroom, that is 3 and you figure 3 to 5 stories for each one of those people. you are missing 15 to 25 news stories every week that you could have told your newspaper readers. That is huge. You, as a consumer, are losing the opportunity to learn about anywhere from 15 to 25 stories a week. And so we exist to do this journalism. But there's another thing that we do is we train journalists to do this work at a high level. And I believe in this room are William Penn journalists who just helped IowaWatch do a news story. Is that correct? Did they stop here, or did they come, or were they walkthroughs? Yeah, and they're afraid to say they did good journalism. It was good stuff. At any rate, we work with college students to do this work at a high ethical level so that it can be published anywhere. And then, of course, sustainability, which I'll gloss over because I'm not fundraising. So this is the example that I was telling you about when I was talking about Iowa flunking its integrity test on keeping lobbyist information public. In Iowa, it's really difficult to find out an awful lot about lobbyists other than that they're registered and which bills they lobby for. I want to tell you, here's the perfect example of how the model works. IowaWatch and others like us, and there are about 250 to 300 nonprofit news organizations across the country. The number fluctuates because a lot of them die because it's hard to keep sustainable. Others prop up because you have someone who feels like this is important work. This is a study in contrast, is a story about a black student at the University of Iowa from Haiti. I don't want her yet. Don't want her yet. Black student from the University of Iowa from Haiti who was missing. His father was worried and concerned. Called University of Iowa Student Services. They said, you know, he's an adult, he's a grad student. Sometimes they just do these things. He went to police, and police said about the same thing. Went to the Iowa City Police. Nah, nothing. He's not missing. He knows where he is. He's an adult. You don't know where he is. I have no idea why we keep getting her. At the same time, a white student from Iowa State University went missing, and the campus rallied and went looking for him. The end result is both students were dead and were found dead. But the question that was raised was, why didn't someone at the University of Iowa treat this student like Iowa State treated its student? And a reporter named Jim Malowitz called me up at the Gazette and said, I want to do a story about that. And by the way, what did you guys do when he called the Gazette? And we said, well, we told him that adults are missing. We goofed up too. And so if you notice in the lower right-hand corner, if you can see it, media response depends on information and resources. The Gazette fell on its sword, and we said we were wrong. The Gazette didn't have anyone to cover this story, but IowaWatch did. And Jim Malowitz is from IowaWatch. This is the first IowaWatch story ever published. And when this story was published, I got phone calls from people saying, thank you for doing that. We really appreciate the fact that you did good investigative journalism for once instead of some of the stuff that you do. So, all right, let's get to Kat. She's just begging to be here. I had no idea who Kat Von D was. I don't know if you guys do. She's an artist, tattoo artist, very famous. And she also has a line of lipstick. She apparently has a line of lipstick. Who knew? Not me, until I found out that people were upset about one of her lipstick names, Underaged Red. And so last year, for a whole year, I want you to pay attention to that March date, March 17th, 2015. Kat Von D sparked social media outrage for lipstick named Underage Red. While her artwork should be the topic of conversation, it looks like one of Kat's lipstick's names is the talk of the town, although not for reasons you would expect. And that's because of the title, Underage Red. And this story went nuts. This is the Examiner.com in Hartford. And they are talking about how the Kat Von D lipstick color, underage red, brews fury, outrage for lipstick or for Kat. And Kat Von D actually had to come out with a statement saying, I'm not changing the name of this. I know there's outrage out there about this, but I am not selling it. Even though Business Insider is now jumping on Sephora for selling an inappropriately named lipstick that has people disgusted. Underage red. People are outraged, according to Fortune magazine. They're all over it too. And this story went international. That product was named by creeps. Sephora under fire from critics for selling a lipstick named Underage Red. And so I'm going to show you how I stumbled onto this. I did not learn about this case because of the fury that was going on around the globe about Underage Red. Rather, I found out about this issue from a blogger named Parker Malloy. Parker Malloy is a blogger who wrote about all of this outrage, and she said, you know, I think I started it. When I was at a store, I saw some lipstick. I took a picture of it with my cell phone, and I wrote on my Twitter account, went shopping for some makeup, how on earth is this a lipstick color? That's it. That's how the outrage got started. Parker Malloy was stunned to find out there was outrage, by the way, because she thought it was amusing and like, what the? Took a picture, posted it on, innocent, and as often with these things on the stream, it's just another day in the life of Parker Malloy. Until she found out an international fury and Kat Von D were all involved and had to answer for this. So Parker Malloy, being a smart woman, I don't know her, by the way, but I did send her an email saying that I'm using this in my presentations. Wrote a story about 5 things that the media does to manufacture outrage. And she talked in this about how we just have this propensity, as she says, to be part of a collection of 7 billion whining people organism things. And she talks about how this got whipped into a frenzy. And one person took her innocuous little tweet, turned it into something else, which then someone else picked it up, and then someone else picked it up. Pretty soon it's going crazy. And after all, if people are picking it up, it must be a furor out there. There must be outrage, because a lot of people are saying, this is wrong. And that's about all they said. So at any rate, we have this beast out there called the internet, and we have these different social media outlets, but I want to tell you that we really need to do some thinking about how we view this stuff. Think about this. If you'd have just used, and I don't want to pick on Donald Trump, everyone does, but if Donald Trump at his news conference in September, when he said that Barack Obama was yes born in the United States, and then said the Hillary campaign started the rumor, if real Donald Trump then became your news source for that story, how would you view that story versus how it was viewed when it was vetted? And by the way, the New York Times headline on this, the New York Times, that kind of stodgy old newspaper, their headline for that story was, Trump gives up lie but refuses to repent. And online, the headline read, Donald Trump clung to birther lie for years and still isn't apologetic. And The Atlantic wrote a neat article about this, pointing out the fact that, first of all, the stodgy old Times used the word lie to describe something a presidential candidate was saying, but also said that the Times' approach to that pretty well marked the death of something that we've become accustomed to in political reporting, and that is he said, she said reporting. And so we're seeing some revolutionary things here, but some of them might not be bad. There are risks at hand when you trust just these small sources without doing vetting and having vetting by journalists. The risk are fewer reporters, fewer photojournalists, fewer people supporting news organizations, and in fact, in some instances, people demonizing news organizations. So Milwaukee conservative talk show host David Sykes made waves this year when he said that the harshness of conservative talk radio program, he called it, by the way, the the fall outrage machine. And its, quote, attack on mainstream media bias, end quote, has given us a situation in which its listeners dismiss legitimate media fact-checking as being untrustworthy. Fortunately, there are organizations that are still doing fact-checking, the Des Moines Register, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, excuse me. Oh, this topic just chokes me up. Excuse me. Iowa Public Radio, some television stations, KCCI is a good example, recognize the value of in-depth investigative reporting, not he said, she said. At IowaWatch, I tell young reporters, we don't care what people say, we care what is, but we will listen to what people say. We just measure it against what is. So don't give me a he said, she said story. Excuse me. You might notice that there's an absence now in newscasts. At the end, remember the newscasts used to end with, we're going to leave you now. And I haven't seen that a lot lately. I see the weather usually, but that we're going to leave you now with the talented 5-year-old singing the Presidents of the United States, Cleveland Rocks. And then you see this video for 5 seconds while the credits go. At least we're seeing an elimination of that. It's likely due to the fact that there are fewer people out there collecting news, more so than it is an attention to investigative reporting. But there are news outlets that are doing that, which gets us to the whole question of who's looking out for you. So we've had cuts in the numbers of reporters and editors nationally, but also in Iowa, and it's had an impact on what we know. And our news consumption habits are changing almost constantly. Let me say something about right-sizing. And I'm going to do something here that my bosses at the Gazette never heard me do, and that is defend them. And that is on this notion of right-sizing. News organizations, if you look at it from a practical point, have looked at how viewers and readers are consuming news. This is not like newspapers or television stations, for that matter, all of a sudden deciding we're going to change the way we're doing things. What's really happening is these media organizations are responding to how you and I consume our news and information. And some of that consumption comes from even Facebook. Think about this. Your Facebook friends are editing your news. So the response has to come. And in fact, I would argue that newspapers especially were late to the game. And I'm not the only one who says that. American Journalism Review, Columbia Journalism Review, and other SAS over the years have said that if any organization could mess up responding to changing reader habits, it would be the newspaper organizations that exist out there. So there is a response that they're trying to do. So when we say right-sizing, I can see this idea of responding to how you and I are reading, and we as a news organization need to respond to that with something other than what we did in 1955 when everyone read the evening paper when they got home. Traditional news outlets are collaborating with each other. Here are some things you may or may not know. One of the last things that I was involved with when I was at the Gazette was a meeting with Randy Brubaker, who since has passed on. He was the managing editor of the Des Moines Register, and he called up and said, you know what, there are just things we can't cover in eastern Iowa, and there are things you can't cover in central Iowa. Why don't we work together on some of those things? If we have a good story, you can publish it the next day in the Gazette. If you have a good story, can we publish it the next day in the Register? We'll put your bylines on it. So every once in a while, you'll see in a Register a Cedar Rapids Gazette byline, in the Gazette, a Des Moines Register byline. The two largest papers in the state decided to collaborate so that we could still give news and information to our publics. The Cedar Rapids Gazette and Lee Enterprises 5 newspapers cooperate and share a State House bureau so that they can still cover State House news and join the Des Moines Register as the only other regular coverer of State House news. Now, the Associated Press does cover as well, but the in-depth coverage and the day-to-day coverage that you get in Iowa comes from the Des Moines Register or the Gazette and the 5 Lee newspapers. So there is collaboration. So we are trying as an industry. Each news outlet available to you adds to what you need to know to be an informed citizen. So all of those different organizations that we have who are pumping news at us, this is what I tell people: read them all. Read as many as you can. You can't read them all. It just gets to be overwhelming. But read as many as you can. If you have Fox News and CNN and MSNBC giving you news and information, why not pay attention to them all and then make a judgment? If you have, read different websites, read different newspapers. News organizations are trying to find ways to support journalism financially. That's why you see things such as events that news organizations have. The Des Moines Register has something that a lot of Gannett newspapers are doing now. It's storytellers. If you ever get a chance to go to one, I'd urge you to do so, because they bring people in to just tell stories. Good stories, worth listening to, and they charge you a lot of money, but it seems like a good way to spend the evening, and that is a revenue producing. That is one unique way now that different news organizations are trying to raise money. And here's the reason, is because people still demand good journalism. So really just pay attention to all those different news organizations that exist out there. I think that we're not at a bad time at all, even though it's a revolutionary time. We get more news and information than ever before. But we need discernment on the part of readers, but we also need discerning journalists who can sort through all of this stuff. I thank you for letting me come here. I really appreciate it. Like I said, it's been a privilege. And I'd be glad to answer any kind of questions that people have. Lauren has a microphone, and she will maraud through the audience, Phil Donahue style here, I think. Phil Donahue, for those of you, never mind. I have to explain AM radio too.
You talked about earlier how the way that news work has been changing throughout the years. So how has the companies that you worked with kept up on the changes?
The changes that I had to deal with?
Yeah, through technology.
Oh,
and
yeah. Oh, God.
How do you know how to react and stay with the times?
Yeah, and I was telling Matt Wagner this story before. I was listening to a radio station in Iowa City this morning. Lightning struck. They stayed on the air, but it knocked their computer out. And so the on-air guy, who was all alone, had to reboot his computer while on the air because he had nothing he could go to, because all of his stuff was programmed in a computer. I worked in radio in 1974 until 1980, and we never would have had that problem. We might have been knocked off the air, but and then it would have taken our tubes a long time to warm up so we could transmit again. But I would have just taken the cartridges and popped them in, and I'd have taken 3 commercials, I'd have popped them in and let them run while I turned around and tried to figure out what to do. Can't do that now. So in radio, we had these archaic pots, and we had reel-to-reel tape. We had cassette tapes. We took stuff and put them on cassettes. When I played music, I would play it on a disc. I'd get the disc out, and you'd have to, sometimes you'd bump it and skip on the air. When I went to newspapers, we were first on typewriters, but I was one of the first reporters at the Press-Citizen and then the Cedar Rapids Gazette to try out a new technology, which was computers, laptop computers, where we could write stories and send them over the phone lines. These were on TRS-80s. They were called Trash 80s. Actually, I saw one at Museum this year. I thought, oh my God, a Trash 80. My daughter said, hey Dad, they've got a computer over here like you used to have. And I said, oh my God, it's a Trash 80. She said, yeah, that's what it says right underneath it. But the first model that I had could store 2,000 bytes, or 20,000 bytes, 20K. And then I got a high-grade one because I was writing long-form stories, and that stored 35K. So 35 kilobytes total in this machine. And when we sent the story, we had couplers that you put on the ends of phones, and I see the nodding heads. You poor bastards, you had to deal with this thing. But we had couplers that you put on each end of the phone, and it would send at 86 baud rate. And you sit there and wait for the story to plug into the computer at the newspaper. And we thought we were in the future. It was amazing. Although I would send from home, and my children would occasionally pick the phone up on the other end line, and we'd have to start all over. But I can remember I used to look for a payphone to see that so I could file those things. But you know, it's all gotten better. And now, you know, the ad, you know, at the Gazette, when I left there, I mean, we were paginating and doing all of these things that we take for granted now. When we got our first paginator, we were all excited because you could lay out the paper on a screen. So it's all changed dramatically. And I read Neiman reports and some of these other things, and you know, I read 9 to 10 things every day about new technologies and new way of doing news.
I have a question. Yeah, the title of your presentation is "Who's looking out for you," or "Who's watching out for you?" As you know, the media is, we'll say, going through a little bit of a popularity slump right now. To use your term, being demonized in a sense. And you know, in my position as well, feel like the media serves a purpose. It almost seems like with the audience now, it's almost like getting people to take their medicine is not something that they want. They don't, you know, do you find that the public doesn't necessarily want the media, or I mean, if we're not trusting the media and they feel like they can go to sources themselves, how does the media try to gain that trust? And, you know, from my perspective and yours working with young students, how do we, you know, get them to sort of understand the importance of media and journalism?
My theory is that people have the perception that they hate the media, but they consume it all the time. And so their actions betray that. But you know what? Just recently, the Raleigh News and Observer, one of the best newspapers in the state, it's won Pulitzer Prize, and it was sued for libel. And it's a scary case right now for two reasons. One is the jury came out with a $7.5 million judgment against the paper, even though North Carolina law limits damages to $6 million. So the judge took that $7.5 million judgment against the News and Observer and reduced it to $6 million. But the thing that, you know, I was reading about this just today, and I believe it was Columbia Journalism Review. I can't recall which publication I was reading, but the concern that was expressed there was key pieces of evidence in that case were the emails sent back and forth between the reporter and the editor, in which the reporter would say, I'm zeroing in on this person, I'm learning more and more about it, and the editor saying, I can't believe this person's able to function when they're doing these kinds of things. And that was seen by the jury as the newspaper out to get the public official. And it was a story about a public official that the newspaper had all sorts of different people saying was doing a crappy job. The official sued the newspaper. So the gist of the article was juries hate the press, right? I mean, it was the way people felt in North Carolina, is that they're part of the bad guy. And the press does a lot of things to shoot itself in the foot. And this is one of the things I work with young journalists. What I try to teach them is stick with some facts. I see an awful lot of writing where someone says that Hillary Clinton lied to Congress, or Donald Trump lied about about what he did with women. And I try to tell reporters is you've just made a judgment. That judgment is that he lied. New York Times put it in their headline. But how about saying Hillary Clinton said that she did not think the emails that she had on her server jeopardized the public, or that Donald Trump just say what he said. All you got to do is say what he said, and people will know what's going on there. I think that that we do a lot of generalization. So what I try to tell young journalists is quit using generalizations and go to the facts. You know, you don't need generalizations. People can reach their conclusions, and they'll be more enlightened if you actually give them facts, because they'll have knowledge. So yeah, I think it's fashionable to hate us. I think we also get judged by what people see on late night television that they think is news and isn't. On the cable channels, it's talk and it's information and it's not fact finding. It's talk. And again, I get back to I don't care what people say. So I think a lot of that judgment comes from what people see on television as well. We're still spreading the news and information on television while the press is getting criticized. They're reading New York Times stories, and they're still cribbing the Times and Associated Press and Reuters and the Washington Post, even while they're criticizing the press. And by the way, the media is a pretty broad term. I get off on that all the time because I think when we talk about the media, that's media, television's media, the Flintstones is media, CNN is media. Everything, we've taken this word media and we've turned it into reporting we hate. And I'd like to know who the media is, because even the media delivers news about how bad the media is.
Earlier, you brought up a point of the presidential candidates using Twitter to disseminate information to people. This is, I feel, the first time that this has happened. Do you feel like this will be the last time, and why?
No, it won't be. And actually, Barack Obama did it very well in 2008. Used social media for fundraising, not necessarily for delivering news as much. Yeah, I think it's always going to happen now. It's there, and presidential candidates aren't the only one. The Secretary of State's office sends out regular news releases and puts news out. So it used to be that the governor does this. The President of the United States, the President has its news organization, and these things have always existed. They were called the PR department. And what would happen is the PR department would write up a press release and they'd send it to reporters, and reporters then would filter that and write a story. Whereas now politicians feel like they have the ability to reach people directly so that reporters don't distort what they say, whether or not they're distorted. It always is a point of view. But more important, don't cut out stuff, because what we do when we print for print to fit, or when we have a newscast that's in finite time, we have to cut things out. So I believe it's going to happen, and I don't have a problem with it, to tell you the truth, because it takes us right to the source material. And I think source material is the most exciting place to find things. It's just that I believe we need discerning journalists or discerning people to sift through what's said there and give it the context that journalism does. Because good journalism gives you context so that you understand these things that are going on around you, so that you can decide on how it affects what you call the norm for yourself or your notion of the norm.
So do you believe that, say, a tweet could be used as a quote in, say, a news article because it comes from the source? Is that what you're saying, sir?
Well, if you source it, it's news and it happens. So like if Donald Trump tweets something, yeah, it's news because it's news. Or Hillary Clinton tweets something, or Kat Von D, or, listen, at the University of Iowa last year, they had the best defensive back in the country, the Jim Thorpe winner, and after the Rose Bowl, he put out on Twitter that he's staying at Iowa instead of turning pro. So that's news. And then you source it. How did you learn that news? That's another thing that I really try to push people for, young reporters, is source that news. I see a lot of drafts by student journalists in which they write about stuff that we just kind of know, right? And so they write it because we know that that Hillary Clinton has had difficulty with legal issues and challenges from the Republican Party. So they'll write that. And so I remember this week I said, well, which one are you talking about? And she couldn't answer because, I said, well, go back and source it. Go back and source it, and then say she's had legal problems. Tell us what the legal problems were. That to me is good reporting. Yeah, you do. I told them I wouldn't dance, and so I'm not going to do it now. We're just going to have to wait for Lauren to get to you.
You talk about the distrust with news media a lot. From what I've seen a lot of times, that's with especially millennials. They feel like a lot of times it kind of limits their voice of people who without a voice in the first place, like say more young people, young minorities, in news stories featuring them, like say social unrest, like the DAPL protests, pipeline, and Black Lives Matter, shaming women celebrities. It goes on. What can help in your mind to connect better with their concerns, like coverage and social media? In my mind, it kind of goes back to the statistic you provided about the lack of diversity in the news media right now.
Yeah. Well, I think diversity would be helpful because people are making decisions about what to cover. So when you're talking about the Standing Rock pipeline, Democracy Now! Is covering it because nobody else is, and then the reporter got put in jail. I think diversity would help under the current situation, which is fewer reporters, because I think the ultimate answer to that is more reporters, and whether they're citizen reporters or professional reporters, if they're following journalism ethics and telling the story and trying to drill at the truth, like what was done with Democracy Now!, I think that's the answer. Also, during the layoffs, a lot of, how shall I say this gently? I'm 63, so I can say this. A lot of old white guys were gone. And, I think that addresses the diversity thing. They were in charge of newsrooms. I do think that there are a lot of newsrooms in charge that now have a lot of millennials in there, and they're excited and they want to do good work. Their problem is they don't have experiences. And so they make bad decisions as well, the types that, and they don't know things. I saw somebody interview outside of Kinnick Stadium at the football game on Saturday. They do this little, hey, welcome to the game. How are you and what's your name? And they interviewed this little kid, and he said, yeah, what brings you here? And he said, I'm here because my dad's a former Iowa football player. And so she goes to the man and says, oh, really? What's your name? And he said, Tom Paholski. And she goes, oh, what position did you play? And I just cringed, and I'm waiting for his answer. He's a quarterback, and so that's what I'm getting at, is the lack of experience. So, we say in journalism there's no such thing as a stupid question, but, and that wasn't a stupid question. She had to know. But a little research and some knowledge is helpful. I think more reporters are necessary, and citizen reporting is fine. I don't have a problem with it as long as it's vetted. But I think we just need to value it more as we need to know that we value it as much as we do with our actions. So I think that's a great question. It's something that the black, and let me say one more thing about this, and this is about the benefits of social media. Black Lives Matter, social media kept that thing alive, important for this country. And there wasn't enough reporters could do to give that story justice that citizens could do with social media. The uprising in Egypt a few years ago gets a lot of attention because that was a social media-driven revolution, which is exactly why my friend in Vietnam, when he's talking with the people there, they're trying to figure out how to control social media so that something like that doesn't happen in Vietnam also. Yeah.
I got two questions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you covered on it or not. What inspired you to get into journalism?
Oh, yeah. What inspired me for journalism was I just was always interested in learning stuff. I have a curious mind. And I also, I'm not just curious, but I really want to know the truth about things. Like when I was a kid, I always wanted to know how things worked, and I always wanted to know why people did things the way they did. I was raised in a politically aware family, not a politically active family, although my grandfather was active in politics, but my parents weren't. But they talked about this stuff all of the time, and they were news engagers. Our house, when I was a little kid, we had 3 newspapers in our house. My parents subscribed to 3 newspapers, and we watched the newscasts all the time because that was an important part of the day. So I wanted to do that, and as I was getting out of high school and getting into college, Watergate broke, and I saw a chance, I saw what real dogged journalism could mean to a country if you did it the right way. So that's what inspired me to get into journalism.
My next question is, through your entire career, what has inspired you?
Say that again.
Through your entire career, what has inspired you?
I still didn't hear. I'm sorry. I really apologize.
Through your entire career, what has inspired you?
Oh, what's inspired me through my, thank you. Other journalists, like other really good journalists, and some of them have been my friends. And so when I worked at the Iowa City Press Citizen, I worked with some really good reporters, and we'd try to one-up each other. We just would, someone would get a good story and we go, well, okay, now it's my turn. And we just would talk about this stuff. So I was inspired by that. And I'll tell you the truth, I'm still inspired by all of the President's Men and the work that Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein did with Watergate. There's an interesting part in that book that tells me, that tells me how journalism has changed for the worse. There's a point in time when Woodward and Bernstein find out that one of Nixon's operatives is in California. I can't remember who it was. I think it was Donald Segretti, but now if I'm wrong, it's going to live virally on this video. They tell Ben Bradley that they found the guy in California. Ben Bradley tells them to get on the plane, the next plane, and go out there to interview him, and don't come back without the interview. Now, what we would do is we'd say, well, let's call him, and let's see if he calls, and try to find out where he works and see if he can get his cell phone number so we can call him. And if that doesn't work, maybe we can get a freelancer to go. So we make decisions like that that are just driven on the resources available. And by the way, some of those resources available have something to do with media companies want to keep their profit margins up as well. But they're a business, and that's the way things work. So that's what inspired me, was just other good journalists, and they still exist. And actually now I'm inspired by the journalists who worked with me as students. My first intern, Jeremy Olson, won a Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago up at the Minneapolis Tribune. And another one of my former reporters, he was a student of mine too when I taught a class at the University of Iowa in political reporting. Nathan Hill just has one of the hottest books out called The Knicks, which the New York Times reviewed. John Irving reviewed for the New York Times. And so now I'm finding that former interns with whom I worked are inspiring me.
I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. If you want to stick around for a little bit, we have cookies and coffee to talk. But I would like to give another round of applause for Lyle for coming tonight.
Thank you, everybody.